Hello, it's July 18th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have journalist and reporter Nick McAlpin.
Hello.
And journalist and reporter Louay Faour.
Hi, Hugo.
There is no greatness where there is not simplicity, goodness and the news. On with the show. First story this week, that's you, Louay.
Israel's relentless air and ground campaign continues in the Gaza Strip with yet another brutal massacre committed on Saturday, this time in Al-Mawasi, an area that was supposed to be a safe zone. Also this week, Shia Muslims across the world celebrated Ashura, the first since the start of the Gaza war, and the ongoing tragedy and the military struggle of Shia groups is central in the mind of many celebrating. One eyewitness in Gaza spoke to reporters after the Al-Mawasi massacre. Two civil defense cars were directly targeted. As you can see, there are people who have lost limbs everywhere. It's a scene the mind cannot even imagine. To see what we've seen, it's beyond imagination. Rockets directly targeted people. Everywhere people have lost limbs. You can see them. They've been cut to pieces. Their bodies have been cut to pieces. This is not normal. What is happening? Why is this happening to us?
Louay, another tragically violent week for Gaza. This week, as you mentioned, reports of a massive death toll in Al-Mawasi. Fill us in. What happened?
So Al-Mawasi is an area in the southern Gaza Strip where thousands, possibly tens of thousands of Palestinians have been forced to move to after being forced out of their homes in other parts of the territory. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be a safe zone for these displaced Palestinians living in tents, living in unimaginable conditions.
When you say a safe zone, the Israelis have declared it a safe zone.
The Israelis have declared it a safe zone,
right.
And yeah. So basically, Al-Mawasi is the area in just north of Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip, which was targeted by Israel. At least 90 people were killed, and many more injured when the camp was struck. Israel says it was targeting senior Hamas officials. It claims that it was going after Hamad al-Daif, the head of Hamas's military wing, Al-Qassam brigades, and a second Hamas official. One of the two commanders was confirmed killed, but it came at a very high cost for civilian lives.
Obviously. What do we know specifically about these Hamas leaders and sort of who they were? And is there... I mean, you say one of them was killed. What about the other one? Do we know if he's dead? Do we know if he's even there or not?
So Israel had initially reported that Mohammed al-Daif, who, as I mentioned, is the leader of Al-Qassam brigades, Hamas's military wing, was injured in the strike. Then later on, Israeli media said it wasn't sure about Daif's condition, whether he was dead or alive, and that they were waiting for more information on him. Hamas says he's still alive, but not much more has been made available. Daif is a very shadowy Hamas figure. Not much is known about him, but he is thought to have orchestrated the October 7 attacks in southern Israel, which sparked the war.
He would be a key target then for Israel.
Yep. In December, the Israeli media published photos of Daif they claimed were very recent. Some people actually interpreted this as a warning or a threat by Israel, an indirect warning that he was next on the hit list. So Daif is allegedly fine, but the Israeli strike on Al-Mawasi killed his associate, Rafa Salameh.
Okay. Has the international community said anything about this? Oh, I mean, let's be honest, it's another week and another just appalling tragedy, an appalling war crime that has been committed. Are they still saying things in the international community, or have they kind of given up?
I mean,
pushing
as always,
out the same stock response?
As always, countries, they were quick to condemn the massacre. The US, Israel's biggest ally, conveyed its, quote, serious concerns with the high civilian toll. Pro-Palestinian governments called on Israel to immediately halt its indiscriminate killing of civilians, but that's as far as it goes. Nothing more than that. Israel is still receiving arms from its allies. Ceasefire talks are yet to reap any sort of deal or consensus in Gaza. Since the start of the war, we've seen, horrific attacks where hundreds have been killed and injured in single strikes. But nothing's changed. It's 9 months later, more than 38,000 people have been killed. World-renowned medical journal, The Lancet, actually gives a total of 186,000 plus people killed.
Yeah.
So they believe the number to be much higher than that.
We spoke about that last week on the podcast, that report.
But, I mean, unfortunately, it's actually hard to tell right now as the war goes on because, many are buried beneath the rubble, people have gone missing. More mass graves will likely be found in the future. So, that's all the international community has done so far, as what they've been doing since October the 7th and what they've done in previous years, in previous wars on Gaza. Condemnation after condemnation.
But very little action.
Yeah.
You also mentioned it's Ashura this week, an important date for some in the Islamic calendar. Louay, for those of us who are not well-versed, briefly, Ashura, what is it? And also this year, with the celebrations that are happening for Ashura, are they different at all from previous years, given the ongoing war in Gaza?
Definitely. So Ashura comes at a very critical time this year. Muslims, but especially Shias, commemorate the 7th century martyrdom of Imam Hussein, who was the Prophet Muhammad's grandson. It's a very important event for Shias, and it draws in tens of thousands of people from across the world in processions that are held, in many countries around the globe, especially in Iraq. But why is it so important this year? It's because it's the first Ashura commemoration since the start of the Gaza war, and it's seen the involvement of several Shia groups in this war. Many Shia factions in the region are directly involved in this conflict, especially Hezbollah in Lebanon, which we could say is the most powerful of these, Iran-backed Shia militias, as well as groups in Iraq, and you have the Houthis in Yemen, and as I mentioned, all of these are supported in every way by Iran. Politically, people who commemorate Ashura, they support the Palestinians. Militarily, they've opened so-called support fronts and are firing rockets and drones into Israel on a nearly daily basis. But ideologically, which is very important, is they feel that it's their religious duty to support the weak and fight the oppressed. They feel that they must follow in the footsteps of Imam Hussein, who they remember to be the martyr. And the way they're manifesting this is that they're fighting the oppressor, which is Israel, alongside the oppressed, who are the Palestinians. Usually, every Ashura, there are calls to fight corruption, spread justice in the world. This year, it's largely focused on militant fighters who have given their lives fighting Israel and who have vowed to continue in the war, because Ashura, this year, there have been calls by imams and by people commemorating the event that we will continue the war till death.
Finally, there's also news of a shocking act of barbarity, I think is probably the best word for it, in Gaza, which was then followed up by some highly irresponsible reporting or what was deemed to be highly irresponsible and immoral reporting and, I suppose, editorializing from the BBC. Louay, just sort of fill us in. What happened with this?
So another tragic story, a man in his early 20s with Down syndrome was mauled by an Israeli combat dog during an Israeli military raid in Al-Shuja'iyya in eastern Gaza City, which has seen very fierce street battles in the past few weeks between Israel and Hamas. The BBC decided to report on the incident as if it had nothing to do with the Israeli military raid, and as if this 24-year-old man with Down syndrome was just like, his death was just imminent, and people were just expecting him to die. Initially, the BBC headline read, "The lonely death of Gaza man with Down syndrome."
That does not do justice to what happened there at all.
Of course not.
Makes it sound like this was some kind of unavoidable tragedy that had happened because of maybe a medical reason, or maybe
and that he was just there by himself, and that he had just been left to die for if you didn't bother to actually go and read in the article and you just read that headline, you would just thought like, poor guy died in Gaza, God knows why, and without giving any reasons. But appalling as it is, we've seen this kind of reporting from many Western outlets since the start of the Gaza war, which are keen to portray Israeli war crimes in a way as, using keywords as explosions, incidents, found dead, rather than actually saying that these are Israeli strikes and these people are being killed. So it comes as no surprise to us at all. But following the backlash, the BBC changed the headline to, quote, Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, mother tells BBC. Even with the amended headline, it's like they're leaving room for speculation to say this is what his mother says instead of this is what actually happened.
Yeah, it's still not, it is an improvement, but it's still not ideal, is it?
Yeah.
At all. But yeah, as you said, I think it has been a running problem with many Western outlets. And I think the BBC I like the BBC. I think they do great stuff. But over the course of this war, they have really, it would seem, let themselves down. I'm not quite sure why they've chosen this line. I don't know. Nick, what do you think?
I think it's not necessarily that they've chosen a line. I think it's the kind of media and political ecospace that we live in the West, right? Consciously or unconsciously, this is the position that might be taken, or the kind of overall feeling and sentiment that you might get from the UK government or from other Western governments. And whether or not the BBC consciously says, okay, we're going to adopt this line, by living in that society, you're going to be influenced by that, whether you realise it or not. And I think that is potentially part of the problem.
Yeah, I think, obviously you had the attack on October 7th. By, October 10th, I think it was pretty apparent to everybody that what we were witnessing was something very different with what Israel was doing. You would have
even
thought
earlier than that. Yeah.
Even earlier, even by the 8th or 9th, you would have thought that there would have been some sort of big sit-down meeting somewhere amongst news editors of the BBC saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to, what is our line here, our editorial line?
There may have been.
Maybe there was, because they could have been completely neutral and said, Israel, and in their work say, Israel did this and Hamas did this. And that's not taking a side, that's just saying out, this is what's happened, which is, the fundamentals of journalism. Yeah, and they haven't said that in a lot of their reporting.
If you remember, at the very start of Israel's war on Gaza, many media outlets, you'd have this very strange situation where every time a Palestinian guest was on, they're not connected to Hamas, they're not a member of Hamas, but they'd always been asked, do you condemn Hamas? And they were always like, well, hang on a minute. Yeah. What have I got to do with Hamas? But then when you'd have Israeli guests come on, you wouldn't then get the same question, do you condemn the Israeli military? Do you condemn the Israeli military? So there's always that kind of, I would call it a, lack of balance, if you want to use kind of impartial media terminology.
And I feel like, neutrality doesn't work with the current Israelis who are in positions of power, because if it's either you're with us or you're against us. So having this sort of neutral stance on what's happening is, you need to condemn Hamas, you need to be open about how you're against Hamas and what Hamas did on October the 7th. And also, let's not forget the whole throwing around the word anti-Semitism at anything. So even slight criticism of Israel in this regard risks
I think that
you as someone who's anti-Semitic, which causes.
It's been a campaign of Israel for a long time to tie anti-Semitism and criticism of the Israeli government together. They've been very successful in that, and I think that is probably a genuine fear of the BBC.
Just very briefly on that.
Final point, Nick.
I was just going to say, I think as well, talking about when Palestinians are asked, they've got no connection to Hamas, but they're asked to condemn a group they have nothing to do with. Actually, that is anti-Palestinian racism, because, why would they have to condemn something any more than I would as an Englishman? They've got no relation to that. So I think that actually is a form of racism in and of itself.
Next, we're moving to you, Nick, for our second story of the week.
Yes, Hugo. So Israel's parliament, or the Knesset, on Thursday plunged a knife further into hopes for a two-state solution when it voted on a resolution rejecting the establishment of a Palestinian state. The vote comes amid large-scale land grabs in the West Bank and high levels of illegal settler activity. The UN Secretary-General's Chief of Staff addressed the UN Security Council on Wednesday, July 17th.
We must change course. All settlement activity must cease immediately. Israeli settlements are a flagrant violation of international law and a key obstacle to peace.
Nick, fresh news from the Knesset today. Israeli lawmakers, they voted on a resolution. Tell us, what was the resolution? What was the result?
Yeah, so as you say, Israel's Knesset or parliament today voted to reject the establishment of a Palestinian state, 68-9. The resolution was co-sponsored by extreme right-wing groups from the governing coalition and opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Opposition leader Yair Lapid's centrist Yesh Atid party abstained. But lawmakers from Labour and the Palestinian Hadash Ta'al and Ram parties were the only ones to actually oppose the motion.
They're the 9 votes.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Not 100%, but I believe so.
I mean, this is obviously bad for prospects of a two-state solution, but that comes from a place where hopes were fairly close to rock bottom anyway. Why is there a reason why this is now different to just the general bad feelings about the prospects of a two-state solution?
I wouldn't say it's different, but it's interesting because it's so explicit. I actually might as well read a little bit from that resolution. So it says, the Knesset of Israel firmly opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state west of Jordan. The establishment of a Palestinian state in the heart of the land of Israel will pose an existential danger to the state of Israel and its citizens, perpetuate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and destabilize the region. There was also a similar resolution sponsored by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that passed in February, rejecting the unilateral establishment of a Palestinian state. I think it's perhaps the timing more than anything that adds to the significance. So it comes after Israeli group Peace Now said Israeli authorities had in June declared that a large amount of land in the West Bank belonged to the state, meaning the Israeli state.
Yeah.
And that's the largest area designated for essentially land theft since the Oslo Accords, which were agreements signed in the 1990s that led to the establishment of the PA, or Palestinian Authority.
Do you think it's significant that rather than it just being an incredibly negative attitude towards a two-state solution, there is now sort of an official parliamentary backing to say no two-state solution? Do you think it makes it more significant in that sense?
Not really. I mean, as I said, there was a similar resolution that passed in February. But whether or not it's openly said or said under the table quietly, what really matters is the actions on the ground. And that's going to happen no matter what the Knesset says. That's the overarching policy, whether it's spoken or not. Perhaps it might allow Israel to be a bit more brazen. But the fundamental crux of the issue is kind of irrelevant in a sense to this. It's just shocking that they're actually willing to come out and say this so clearly before the world.
Yeah. We heard a brief bit of it beforehand. The UN Secretary General's office also spoke on a two-state solution on Wednesday. What did they have to say?
Yeah, so UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' chief of staff delivered some remarks on his behalf on Wednesday to the UN Security Council. And he said that, quote, recent developments are driving a stake through the heart of any prospect for a two-state solution.
That's not good.
It's not good. I think driving a stake through the heart implies that it's alive, and I don't think it is alive or has been alive for a long time. But at least this is being addressed by senior officials on a world stage. And then the chief of staff, he said that Israeli administrative and legal measures were changing the geography of the occupied West Bank, and mentioned that it was anticipated large land grabs in key areas and changes to planning, land management and government would significantly speed up settlement expansion. It's not great, is the message, but you have to wonder, is this too little too late? Should this have been the kind of thing that was said 20 years ago, perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, the Israelis don't listen to their allies, they don't listen to US criticism of illegal West Bank settlements and that sort of activity. They're not going to listen to the UN either.
They have a big beef with the UN.
They've got a big beef, yeah.
So realistically, no. If the UN encourages Israel to do something, will they listen? Most of the time, no.
Yeah.
Could it perhaps apply pressure on member states of the United Nations. They might change their policy, possibly. Some who are arming and ahhing one way or the other. Okay, you know what? The UN chief via his chief of staff is saying this. Maybe. But I think, in a sense, he's kind of saying the right things, right? I said maybe he needs to be going further because this is kind of rhetoric that would have been suited 20 years ago. Now it needs to be stronger, given the present circumstances. But realistically, it comes down to the question of the US. That's who holds.
Well, this was to the UN Security Council as well.
Yeah, of course.
Where the US with a
permanent
US
member, yeah,
and they have their veto power.
And they have a veto. So, you know, the US will be listening, of course. Will they then take the information into action? It's in their gift to do it or to not. I suspect not. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, the world is at the mercy, as I suppose, maybe to use the word, of what the US administration wants to do.
I suppose one good thing is they are, talking about a broader two-state solution and the West Bank, which, over the past 9 months, appalling things have been happening in Gaza, but terrible things have also been happening in the West Bank. So
very true.
Some good focus on that, I think, is to their credit. Sticking with the West Bank, this week, illegal settlers were the subject of a number of sanctions. Nick, who were sanctioned? Why have they been sanctioned? Any particular behaviour of theirs that's worth sanctioning? Who have they been sanctioned by? And I fear I know the answer already, but can we hope that these sanctions will curb their behaviour?
Yeah, so first we'll go back to Thursday last week, because that's when the United States announced sanctions on, quote, 3 Israeli individuals and 5 entities connected to acts of violence against civilians in the West Bank.
Right.
One of those groups that was targeted was the far-right Lahava group. That's quite well known. And the sanctions also target settlements. And the European Union on Monday announced its own sanctions. And those were against individuals and entities that it said are, quote, responsible for serious and systematic human rights abuses against Palestinians in the West Bank. So that's kind of what and who and why. As for whether this will curtail their actions, I think it would do if it was more widespread. So you're talking about a limited selection of individuals and entities. But you have to remember that you have hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers. I think it's more than 700,000 across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem.
Right.
So you'd need to sanction all settlers, or at least a majority of settlers, for this to really provoke change. Because
the number they're actually going for is actually a very, very small percentage.
Small, when you think about hundreds of thousands versus a few groups and a few individuals, it's not masses. And even if it affects them seriously, right, you've still got all those other hundreds of thousands to worry about.
Louay, you had a question.
I mean, on the topic of what's happening in the West Bank, Israel's far right has long made it very clear they're against any two-state solution. And we just saw very recently Israel carry out the biggest land grab in the occupied West Bank since the Oslo Agreement. At this point, with everything that's happening, with the expansion of settlements, with settler violence, and as the Palestinian Authority's control over the West Bank gradually fades, and obviously with what's happening in Gaza, what hopes are there for an independent Palestinian state at this point? And will the recognition of several countries recently help with the Palestinian cause? So recently we saw, countries like
Spain,
Armenia, Spain, Norway, Ireland, the Slovenian parliament all agreed to recognize Palestine. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's always a positive when a country gives its recognition. But at the end of the day, while it probably adds a little bit of pressure to Israel around the edges, I don't think it's ultimately enough to force a significant change of policy. Israel will change when either it wants to change or when its key ally, the United States, as I've said probably too many times today, decides that it's time for a change. And until that happens...
So you think the US can actually make Israel reach a sort of an agreement or a settlement in which Israel is forced to accept a Palestinian state or recognize an independent Palestinian state?
If the US was so motivated and had the intention and the willingness to put political capital into this, it could absolutely.
Do you think so?
100%.
I would have said that for sure. I think last September. Since this war has been going on, I constantly find myself sort of questioning who is the dog and who is the tail in this Israel US relationship, and who's wagging what, because I don't think it's as clear cut as all of that.
Well, obviously both sides influence each other because that's the nature of any relationship, whether that's between Israel and the US or the UK and France. But I think at the end of the day, the US is the dominant side of that equation. Remember, Israel is very reliant on the US when it comes to weaponry and military aid. So if the US was like, do you know what, we're cutting that off until you agree to this, Israel may drag its feet and try and get the best deal possible that it could get. But I think ultimately they would have no choice.
So the US calls the shots. So you think despite 100%. The US, publicly saying that they want a two-state solution, that they support a two-state solution, and that's the only way to achieve peace, you don't think that they're actually serious at this point? Like right now?
Look, I can't say what's in the head of US officials. It may be that they very sincerely want this to be the case and for this to happen.
They just haven't taken any serious steps to make that happen.
Can say anything. I can say I want X, Y, but I haven't got no power, so it doesn't matter.
Of course.
And the same way, the US has power, and if they say they want something, it only matters if they follow through. You can say a lot, until you do something, it means nothing, or very little.
Finally, Nick, this week, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, they are expected, it will be on Friday, so that'll be today as you're listening to this podcast, to reveal the contents of an investigation about the West Bank. Briefly, what are they investigating? Do we know what they're going to say? And is it going to have any impact on the illegal settlements we've been talking about, on the West Bank, on the lives of Palestinians?
Yeah, so the International Court of Justice will give its advisory opinion on Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories tomorrow as we're recording it, so Friday, as listeners get this in their feed. So it's an 18-month investigation by the UN's top court and includes the opinions of more than 50 countries about whether this violates international law, basically. And it's interesting that a leading Israeli official reportedly said there are worries that the report will be, quote, very negative. Something that's possibly worth noting is that far-right Israeli Minister Bezalel Smotrich, a common name on this podcast, has urged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to, quote, apply sovereignty to the territories of the homeland. I guess he means the West Bank there.
Yeah.
If the ICJ, quote, does decide that the settlement enterprise is illegal. And I think if the outcome is, to use that phraseology from a leading Israeli official, very negative for Israel, it may put pressure on the US and other Western countries to take action. But again, the US is in a league of its own and no one can really force its hand. Sure, a bit of pressure, maybe small changes around the edges, but it's ultimately down to Washington if it decides it's in its interest to act or to not do so. And it can also, of course, decide on the strength of any potential action. Joe Biden's coming up for a very tough election campaign against Donald Trump. Is he going to want to rock the boat at this point, particularly where support for Israel is very strong in the United States? I don't know. I don't think that's likely. He's not got a lot to gain electorally, unfortunately, by taking a risk on this particular issue.
I think next week we will talk more about the ICJ investigation. Final story from me this week. On Wednesday, the Trans-Mediterranean Migration Forum opened in Libya with representatives from 28 European and African countries in attendance. It was hoped that the conference would be able to establish strategic cooperation between the countries' migration strategies. Among those in attendance was Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She said this:
For what the United Nations tell us is that human trafficking is nowadays one of the most powerful criminal, traffic in the world. There are people making lots of money using the desperation of the fragile persons.
So Hugo, what was this forum and what were they hoping to achieve?
This was the Trans-Mediterranean Migration Forum. It was in the Libyan capital of Tripoli, hosted by Libyan Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeibeh. Of the big names that were there, Meloni, Italian Prime Minister, was sort of the big name from Europe.
And they have a long history, don't they, Libya and Italy? So
Yes. Well,
colonial history.
Yes, yeah. The general sort of impression is that they were. The whole point of the forum was to try and sort of create a united front between, namely Italy and also Malta as well. They were there, and North African, other African, sub-Saharan African countries. I think the idea is essentially to be a louder voice. They've all been talking about it individually. They want to be a more united, louder voice. I think particularly in light of the war in Gaza, which has dominated the conversation. But migration issues in the Mediterranean are still ongoing. They're a problem. They're actually getting worse as well. There was a big dip in the numbers crossing in 2019 during pandemic years and things like this. It's now gone up a lot. It's about the same levels as it was in 2016 or so. So it's really increasing. And there are still people dying, still trying to cross the sea. Conditions for migrants in North Africa is incredibly bad. The smuggling gangs that exist in North Africa, with that sort of criminality spreads other criminality, which is a problem for the likes of Libya, for the likes of Tunisia, and also Egypt to a different degree. In Libya we've had slave markets open, which I think when you have slave markets open, it's a serious problem.
You're in a bad place.
And that's been going on for years with all of Libya's chaos. And
just some statistics. This is in 2023. There was an increase in crossings in what's called the Central Mediterranean route. That is the route from North Africa to Italy and Malta, up 54% to 162,700. Across all the three Mediterranean crossing routes, there was an increase of 29% of deaths at sea. 3,105 people reported dead or missing in 2023 across the three routes. That's compared to 2,411 2022. The International Organization for Migration identified 704,369 migrants from over 43 nationalities in the 100 Libyan municipalities, which is a huge number. Just this year, Italy, which sees a lot of migrants landing along this central Mediterranean route, they recorded between January 1st and July 16th, over 30,000 arriving from North Africa.
So, Hugo, what exactly are they asking for at this forum?
The forum, collectively, as a group, want money. That's what they want. They've been given money in the past. Some estimates from Italian NGO suggest that the Libyan Coast Guard has received 100 million euros in aid from the EU and Italian authorities. Worth noting, that's at the same time as the Libyan Coast Guard has been accused of some quite appalling abuses against migrants. I think, as you probably both know, the problem is generally not what money they get, it's how it's spent.
Yep.
Right? In the past, it's gone to people like the Libyan Coast Guard, who have committed abuses, or have certainly been alleged to have committed abuses, and the problem, of migration has not improved. Migrant numbers going through North Africa to Italy, they're going up.
The problem hasn't been fixed.
The problem has not been fixed.
It's because people want to move for a better life, right? So you have to.
So this is, I think, one of the most interesting developments from this forum, right? Is that you have the likes of the Libyan Prime Minister saying, "Don't give the money to us. The money needs to go to the home countries of these people who are leaving, to create projects there to make things better, so they don't want to move in the first place." He said, quote, "The idea is simple. The money used for resources should be spent in African countries and on the people there who send migrants. It should not be spent at sea in rescue boats, in the desert, or in detention centres in Libya or Europe." Even Giorgia Meloni agreed with this. She said this as well, which, she has got quite the history of migrant bashing and, is known as a far-right politician. She's not keen on them at all. And even she...
I think it's common sense, though, isn't it, really?
It is common sense. But, come on, Nick. I mean, where's the space for common sense when it comes to migration debates? It hasn't been there for a long time.
Very true.
And I think when you got the likes of Georgia Maloney even saying, yeah, we should be funding African countries, I feel that's quite a good step forward in this debate.
I think with what Nick means when he said common sense is in terms of rather than actually facilitating their entry into Europe and letting them come into Europe, keep them in their countries and let's help them where in their countries and let's solve the root cause of all these issues so they stop trying to make that journey into Europe.
Displaced. They would. Everyone would prefer to stay in their country. They love their country. Everyone does.
Because it's not about keeping them in their country. It's about ensuring that there's no desire to leave in the first place.
Well, exactly. Solving the issues that they face, so that they stop. So they stop crossing borders and then eventually make into Europe. Yeah.
Wherever you're from, there's nowhere like home. So if you have the opportunity to stay at home, you will.
Yeah. So I think this is, that's why she spoke in support of actually giving money to these countries rather than having to deal with them.
I think it is a good development. I mean, Maloney, she did also denounce criminal organisations who decide who has the right or not to live in our countries, adding that illegal migration is the enemy of legal migration.
Yeah. On top of all these human trafficking rings, when we talk about the Libyan Coast Guard or Coast Guards of any of these countries, especially when we talk about Libya, we're talking about a lack of transparency. So as well as abuses, we're talking about corruption. Where are these millions ending up? Where is this money actually going?
Million,
so they're obviously, benefiting from this as well. They're asking for more money. And
I don't know how much a boat costs, but I'm guessing it's a lot less than 100 million euros.
One interesting point, I guess, for me is, was Tunisia at this forum? Because migration is a big issue for Tunisia as well.
Yes, Tunisia was there. Tunisian Prime Minister Ahmed Hashani attended. Now, this is sort of where it did, after all that sort of, let's be honest, pretty good stuff from the Libyan Prime Minister and Maloney. He turned up and said, give Tunisia loads of money. He didn't seem to follow on the same idea of giving the money at the source of the problem. He just said, more money for Tunisia. He told the conference, quote, more assistance must be provided to countries such as Tunisia. The aid provided is insufficient to address the problem. Worth noting that the European Union dispersed 150 million euros, $164 million, to Tunisia in March as budget support for financial stability and economic stability as part of a deal aimed at fighting illegal migration.
But he thinks that because his country is burdened with the financial crisis and with other crises, he thinks that this money obviously isn't going to do anything with Tunisia accommodating such a huge number of sub-Saharan African migrants. So he's asking for more money.
So I think he's asking for more money to deal with the problem inside the country. The likes of Libya and Italy are asking for more money to go to the source of the problem so they don't turn up in the first place. I think this is the general impression I get is that both Libya and Italy, maybe the EU to a lesser degree, have sort of realised that the prospect of these people voluntarily returning home is zero.
Of course,
So they just need to sort of turn it off at the source, and then they could probably actually have a much better, a much easier time of dealing with the migrants that do exist, and either return them home if that's what they choose they want to do, or find them employment, integrating them into society, and giving them jobs and things like this.
Which also creates obviously more challenges and more.
Yes.
And also there's the point that, a lot of the economic problems in African countries are the result of European colonial history. So there's a duty there to kind of address that balance of
and intervention.
And interventions, colonialism, all these problems.
On Tunisia still, Tunisia has an election coming up, I believe in October, presidential election. And the whole issue on migrants in Tunisia is still a hot topic, And the President Qais Said, who seized power in 2021, I guess is using this issue on migrants to garner more support in Tunisia. There's also this, fear-mongering of African migrants that they're here to replace us. Yeah, and there's, we've heard and we've read about a lot of issues facing African migrants in Tunisia, and Tunisians are saying that we're fed up and our country's burdened. We can't put up with this, huge number of migrants coming into the country anymore. What's going on there on the election front, and how will migration play a role in the presidential election? Will it be a big issue? I mean, is Qais Said still trying to capitalize on this?
So yes, there is going to be a presidential election.
Yeah,
it's going to be held on October 6th.
Yeah.
The incumbent, as you mentioned, President Qais Said. Now, spoiler alert, he's going to win, right? How do I know he's going to win? Because he wants to win, right? So just this week, actually, we had the leader of Tunisia's sort of Islamist-inspired opposition party, Ennahda. He was arrested on Saturday. And then on Friday, a Tunisian judge barred another potential presidential candidate from appearing in the media or travelling around the country, which will hurt a campaign. I mean, this comes after the leader of Ennahda. He's been in jail since last September. The former prime minister, he was arrested, and the acting chairman of Ennahda, he was also arrested.
Yep.
More than 20 of Qais Said's political opponents and sort of other prominent figures have been arrested since last year. So Qais Said is going to win this.
So there's a sweeping crackdown on the opposition, journalists, politicians,
Tunisia,
media personalities.
Is, heading towards a one-man presidential race at this rate. Okay?
But it will still be interesting to see, because he's at least got to give, I don't want to say the pretense of a campaign, right? So what are the issues going to be there? I think that's the question.
So then migration will be an issue. I mean, over the past few months, we had protests and marches through the streets against the presence by Tunisians against the presence of sub-Saharan migrants. Right? There's obviously economic problems in Tunisia.
Yep.
Qais Said is, like all, so many populist leaders, when you have economic problems in a country plus high levels of migration, who's to blame? It's the migrants.
The scapegoating.
Is it economic policy? No, it's the migrants, right? So that is going to be, I can anticipate how Said will use migrants and the migrant issue. It's just to whip up a frenzy and whip up a fervour, whip up a bit of nationalism as well, because Nick, as you mentioned, there is a fair amount of racism against black Africans and sub-Saharan Africans in North Africa.
Unfortunately
so. So that's how I think we can anticipate, migration being used as an issue in the campaign. But frankly, ultimately, it doesn't matter. It could be, the price of flour. It could be the price of a cinema ticket. It could be any issue he picks. He's still gonna win.
Has Qais Said actually announced his bid to run for the presidency, or has he not yet?
Well, he hasn't actually confirmed whether he will run or not. He is expected to run, though.
Okay.
And he seems to be putting in quite a lot of effort to jail all his opponents. Yeah. So it would be foolish, I would have thought, to jail all your opponents and then not run.
Just for fun, maybe? I don't know.
Just for fun. If he's into that sort of thing, then maybe.
I guess kind of taking it a bit broader, what sort of impact can we expect the Tunisian election to have on the wider Middle East and North Africa region?
If we start from the assumption that Qais Said is going to win, not a great impact, I would think. Off the back, when we had, the Arab Spring, Tunisia actually came out pretty well on that with a pretty good functioning democracy, which Qais Said has completely eroded now. So essentially we're back to where we were before. He's next to, Egypt, where you got another one-man rule. You got Algeria, which is sliding in a pretty dangerous direction. Even Morocco, there isn't a great plurality and great democratic strength in Morocco. So, it would have more of an impact of the Tunisian elections if it was a free and fair and open democracy, because it would be the outlier in the region.
As it previously was.
if we go ahead to, come October 7th or 8th, whenever the results are announced, he's going to be another dictator in North Africa. Looks set to continue for years to come, unfortunately. Other news this week, really, there's only one other story this week. It's not strictly Middle East related, but Donald Trump, somebody tried to assassinate him at a campaign rally. I think there's a lot of probably quite a few things to say about this. I'm sure we won't get through them all today. But between you two, do you think this has secured victory for Donald Trump?
I think there are two kind of ways this could go. I think there's understandably been a lot of sympathy for him because he's been the victim of serious political violence. Yeah. Luckily, he survived that. It was very close. Will that necessarily translate into support is maybe a different question. Because there's one thing saying this shouldn't have happened. Even Joe Biden's saying this shouldn't have happened. Doesn't mean he's going to vote for him. He's going to vote for himself, true. I would imagine.
I do think it plays into, the Republican Party and sort of the Republican Party led by Trump do seem to have quite a narrative of saying we are the victims. And I think this does play into that in a very real sense for them. They can point to it and go, see, they're after us and they're after you. Well, and this is what they did to me.
I think the left in the US, the Democrats had that same sort of narrative when Trump was president as well. And they were blaming him of destroying America and trying to sort of bring in an agenda that they completely disagreed with. But I think, like what Nick said, it could go both ways because we've been hearing from a lot of people that, this has definitely given Trump the sort of the boost that he needed to win, and that he's definitely going to win, as if the elections have already happened and we know the results and that's it, Trump is president. But then, things could turn around in come November. And
I don't think people will be talking as they are now, saying that how much of a boost this is going to give to Donald Trump if he was against a stronger candidate. But Joe Biden in his candidacy looks so weak right now.
That doesn't help the Democrats as well.
Help at all.
And especially if that they're in this. I don't know if I could say disagreement, but they're unsure whether Biden
I think they are in disagreement.
Does step down, and if he does step down, who's going to replace him in the race? Yeah. So, like you said, Trump does seem like the stronger candidate in this presidential race.
I did think that if any sort of good came out of this event was, for the Biden campaign, it did take off the front pages all those stories about Biden's health and age and this sort of thing, capacity and this sort of thing.
But then with Trump's here.
Yeah, exactly right. But then today it was all back again when he got contracted COVID.
Yeah.
So, and I think Adam Schiff called for him to step aside. I think Chuck Schumer has been talking to him apparently and saying it's time to step aside. There's a lot of good stuff on the New Arabs website this week. Louay, what have you brought for our listeners?
So we have Baghdad's new approach to Turkey's offensive in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is an analysis by Winthrop Rogers, who is currently based in northern Iraq's Kurdish city of Sulaymaniyah. Rogers writes that Iraq is showing more tolerance to Turkey's anti-Kurdish operations as it deals with other serious domestic issues. He believes Iraq is softening its stance with regards to Turkey's cross-border operations that for many years Ankara has carried out, going after the PKK in northern Iraq and in northern Syria. It comes after years of tensions and criticism by Iraq against Turkey, carrying out airstrikes in Iraqi territory, actually carrying out incursions into Iraqi territory. It comes after the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that operations will, quote, soon end in northern Iraq and northern Syria. Rogers seems to argue that Iraq is sort of changing its approach now to how Turkey's dealing with the PKK, what they seem as a threat in Iraq.
Excellent. Nick?
Yeah, and I've now got Mosul's minorities, challenges and coexistence after fall of Islamic State. And that's in our features section, and it's by Shema Madbouli. It's quite a timely story because it comes almost 7 years since the Iraqi city of Mosul was liberated from the the Islamic State extremist group on 21st July 2017. And it's also been just over 10 years since the extremist group captured the city back in June of 2014.
I've picked out from the opinions desk What to Do About the Taliban's Gender Apartheid, written by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who is very involved in this. He's writing off the back of the recent UN meeting in Qatar with the Taliban, where they did discuss things, but they did not discuss the rights of girls and women. It's a good opinion piece and well worth checking out. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by journalist and reporter Nick McAlpin and Louay Faour. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple and Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Until then, if you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. Or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.